we go. We begin chapter 23. In chapter 22, the Alter Rebbe employed as a strategy for the person who was feeling a, um, a sense of distance from Hashem and not prompted or motivated to be closer with Hashem. The Alter Rebbe explained that whenever a person deviates from Hashem, he is completely detaching. You remember the analogy of of divine speech being the constant creative force of all of existence. And when that constant creative force is constantly attached to the infinity of Hashem, any stepping out, any separation from that infinity disrupts and is essentially a form of idolatry. So that seems maybe like a very extreme statement, but as we understand it, idolatry is the attribution of stature to anything outside of the exclusive infinity of Hashem. In this chapter, the Alter Rebbe is going to sort of turn to the upside. How is it then that we can become absolutely aligned with the infinity of Hashem? And our premise is that this is the ultimate goal, is to be in alignment with the infinity of Hashem. You recall from earlier in Tanya, maybe about 10 chapters ago, the Alter Rebbe talked about the gift that is given to the righteous, that they see their world to come in this life. And the world to come is not some sort of semi-cartoonish sense of where you have all of the indulgences of this physical world without any of the negative consequences, but rather what is meant by the world to come is an absolute awareness of the infinity of Hashem, where there's no friction between myself and the infinity of Hashem, where there's total awareness of my identity in the relationship with the infinity of Hashem. So how is that experienced? So in this chapter, we're going to explore essentially, I think, three concepts. I'm going to put it up here on the screen so that you can get a feel of it. And here it is. We're going to be exploring this quote from the Zohar that says, the 248 obligatory mitzvahs, the thou shalts, are the 248 limbs of the king. We're going to talk about aligning the body with Hashem via mitzvah actions. We're going to talk about aligning the soul with Hashem via mitzvah actions. And the distinctive characteristic of Torah study that is more than alignment, it is the absolute oneness with Hashem. So these are three concepts that are going to be developed in this chapter as a sort of response to the previous chapter. In the previous chapter, we talked about the deviation from the alignment with Hashem is a total rejection of Hashem, that it's the equivalent of idolatry. And here we're going to talk about how we can be in perfect alignment with the infinity of Hashem, how it affects our humanity, how it affects our neshama, and the difference between the effect via Torah study in contrast to mitzvah observance. They're similar and yet different. Of course, Torah study is a mitzvah, and yet it has its own identity and character as well. So that's where we're headed in this discussion in this chapter. So here we go, chapter 23. V'im kol hanal, together with everything that we have spoken about, which again is a reference to the person's coming to the Alter Rebbe. He's not feeling aligned with Hashem. He's feeling this disconnect. And the Alter Rebbe comes with the emphasis that Hashem is creating the world. The world was not just created 5,700 years ago. It's a constant and continuous creation. And that constant and continuous creation is like the speech of of a human being, but also not exactly like a human being. We talked about the differences there, that a person says his words, he goes on, and the words are there forever. But Hashem has to constantly be speaking the words in order for them to have their sustainability and so forth. So, Im Kol Anal, with all of this that we have discussed, Yuvin v'Yavuir Hativ, we will understand and we will comprehend well. Now, when the Alter Rebbe, we've seen this phrase before, says that we'll understand it well, I mean, we kind of hope so. Isn't that the whole point? But what he means is not just that we're going to really know it and we'll be able to recite it back for the test. What he means by this is that it will have personal and specific application within our identity. We will understand it so well that it will penetrate our very awareness. The Tosfos Biur, by further explaining Mash Amaru b'Zohar, this that it says in the Zohar, and that was the quote that we had up on the screen a few moments ago. The Araisa v'Kutra Kula Chad, that we say that Torah and Hashem are absolutely one. Now, when we say Torah in this context, we mean the mitzvah of Torah study. Now, you recall from earlier in Tanya that the Alter Rebbe describes the difference of the alignment in Torah study in contrast to mitzvah observance. And it's not a competition, although sometimes it feels like, well, which one is superior? Is it superior to study Torah or is it superior to do mitzvahs? And depending on the context, the answer is going to change because you have to do the mitzvahs. Sitting and reading about shaking the lulav and eating the matzah is not going to impact the world the way eating the matzah and shaking the lulav itself is going to. On the other hand, when I eat the matzah, I have a few of aspects of my biology that are invested in it, but it doesn't necessarily change something about me entirely. Whereas when I study Torah, I have an in-depth connection with Hashem. It's like I'm studying Hashem. I'm not just studying the laws, I'm studying God himself, because God has invested himself in the Torah as a vehicle for us to be connected with him. It is Hashem expressing himself in the words as a mechanism for us to be in alignment with him. And again, as we constantly emphasize, that God created the world because he has a purpose and a mission and a desire that this world, flaws and all, warts and all, be transformed into a place that welcomes him. And therefore, all of Hashem's activities, including the presentation of Torah for study and mitzvahs for actions, are not just busy work designed to keep us occupied so we don't break everything in the meantime. It is genuinely important to Hashem. So every mitzvah action that we do is genuinely important to Hashem. It's not simply some way, like I'm calling it, to keep us out of trouble in the meantime. The Torah itself is an expression of Hashem, although sometimes it's kind of hard to find it there. It doesn't always seem that way. And I've quoted this example before. Actually, it's somewhat timely because the Rambam's yahrzeit was earlier this week. And the Rambam, in his book of law, he begins, page 1, chapter 1, law 1, that it is foundation of all foundations to know Hashem, not just to accept that as a fact, but to actually know Hashem. And at the very end, you fast forward all the way to the end, the last chapter, the last book, the last law, Maimonides Rambam describes what the world will look like when Mashiach comes, and he says it will be filled with the knowledge of Hashem. And in between, you have a lot of laws about a lot of very peculiar and seemingly remote and even a little bizarre kind of scenarios about the laws of purity and impurity and a knob that fits into a potter's wheel or a wagon. And you think like, what? I want to know God. We sort of were enticed with this initial ad that we're going to get to know God, and the goal is to know God. And in the middle, I'm knee deep in all kinds of litigation law, again, and so many other rules and laws that seem to have nothing to do with knowing God. And our explanation is that is, in fact, how we get to know God. This isn't just busy work that we have to wade through in order to get to the end. This is, in fact, where we find Hashem himself in these very specifics and particulars. So here we go. Ubetikunim, in the Tikkunim, which is sort of a commentary or an elaboration on the Zohar, it goes on to explain the Ramach Bikudin, that the 248 instructional, or like we call them, the mitzvahs aseh, or the dues, the obligation mitzvahs, as opposed to the prohibition mitzvahs, Inun Ramach Evarin Demalka. These are the 248 limbs of the king. What? And we'll explain all of this. Lefi, and here's the point: Shamitzvis hein pinimius rotzen ha'elyon v'chafetzei ha'amiti ha'malubish b'chol ha'olamais ha'elyonim v'tachtoinim lachayoisam kikol chayusam v'shifam toloi b'maisa ha'mitzvah shal tachtoinim kenoida. Now, what the Alter Rebbe lays out here is pretty intense. And again, it goes back to this general outlook. What is the purpose of creation? Does Hashem create us for our sake, or does Hashem create us for his sake? Are we here to get the most we can out of this world, including out of Hashem? And again, we believe that we can win the argument that Hashem provides us with the, quote, best life. But then it's a debate. I think it does. This guy thinks it doesn't. I like kosher. This guy likes yoga. And then you go back and forth. What is the undebatable is when we say that the world was created for Hashem's purpose. And Hashem has come to us and said, will you please make my passion your passion? Not just help, not just admire, not just cheer me on, but will you make my passion your passion? So rather than thinking about how Hashem serves me, that God gives me, and again, we believe we can win that argument, meaning and purpose and joy and all kinds of other wonderful character traits. We are here to try and get ourselves, though it's a difficult chore, to the characteristic that ultimately stems from Mesiras Nefesh. And Mesiras Nefesh is that inarguable point. Every other argument has a counter argument. This will bring you happy. No, this will make you happy. This will create a justice side. No, this will. And again, we can argue about it back and forth. And then we can go say, oh, I guess you're right. Meanwhile, life has passed me by. But the Mesiras Nefesh argument only exists in Kedusha. There's no such thing as having Mesiras Nefesh for selfishness. That argument is there's no back argument against that. There's no way of pushing back against that. There's only that argument, and there's no counter argument to it. So the Alter Rebbe lays out that the mitzvahs are the Pnimius Haratzai and the genuine desire of Hashem. They are not merely mechanisms to get us to something else. Meaning, if we were to say that pick any mitzvah is designed to get some other result, so then why can't I get that other result in some other form? Meaning, if you're telling me that eating matzah is designed to remind me that our ancestors left Egypt, so come up with some other way. Say, well, there isn't a better way. Then we get into a quibbling about whether this is, in fact, the best way of doing it. And again, we believe that we can win that argument. But then we are conceding that eating the matzah is not really what's important. What's important is some other consequence from eating the matzah. So let's just shortcut it and not eat the matzah and get to the consequence. And again, that seems like an argument that could be made. The pushback to that is that if we see that eating the matzah is in fact the goal, then I can't say, well, I don't want to do that. I want to do it some other way. And anybody who's ever had the experience where someone has asked you, what can I get you, for your birthday? And you tell them, and then they say, well, I think you're going to want something better. Now, it may be very considerate, but it's really ultimately quite insulting. You don't know what you want. I know what you want. Now, if I'm a child, maybe I don't know what I want. But Hashem is not a child. Hashem is not, doesn't make a mistake. And this line here, where the Alter Rebbe says that the mitzvahs are the Pnimius Ratzain Ha'elyon, which I'm going to translate here as the genuine desire from Hashem. It's the essence. It's not some mechanism to get us to something else. And Chafetzai Ha'amiti, and his genuine passion. Again, it's not just something to get us to something else. It is truly what Hashem wants. It is definitively what Hashem wants. It's not just some busy work, and so on. Excuse me. That is invested in all oilamais. Remember the word oilamais, we translate it as worlds. It doesn't mean planets, it's not locales, but it's stages of awareness. Hela means to be hidden in all stages of awareness. So here's the irony. There is a tendency to think, and again, this is one of those basic differentiating points between Hasidus and, again, Torah people, learned people, about what is the role of mitzvahs. Some would argue that what we do is really just like child's play. We don't really understand what it is that we're doing. We're going through some mechanical procedures like we do with the computer. We click a couple of buttons, we get the result we want. We don't really understand what's going on. But some other level, they really understand what's going on. They're not just seeing it as a bunch of random buttons that are being clicked. They really know what's going on. That is a not uncommon understanding of the purpose of mitzvahs. The Alter Rebbe really turns that upside down. Sometimes we're like flabbergasted. Why do they think it's so strange? Well, it's a very different perspective. It's a very different perspective. The perspective is this is really where it's at. And as the Alter Rebbe notes, that all of the life force and all of the purpose of that Hashem sustains all of those, again, what we call higher worlds, but by higher we mean more intuitively aware of the infinity of Hashem, are linked to the mitzvah actions here in this physical world. Now, a perhaps simple illustration of this is one that we are all familiar with, which is a very Chabad idea, where we stand on the street corner and say to a stranger, would you shake the lulav, put on tefillin, light Shabbos candles, light the Hanukkah menorah? And there are people who would say, what is that? Why is it worthwhile? So he does it one time. Why is that meaningful or significant? Well, once we understand that the whole purpose of creation is the physical execution of the mitzvahs, because that fulfills God's will. Does it change the person eternally? Absolutely. But we're not doing it just because of how it affects the person. So when the guy says, I'm good, okay, you're good, but God is waiting for this mitzvah action to be done. And this mitzvah action is what validates the creation process that begins at such a pre-level, a level so much more profoundly, obviously aware of the infinity of Hashem. The Olamais Elyonim, the higher, that is the more sensitive, the more intuitively aware of God level, is waiting for us to do mitzvahs. And this is, again, I like this word radical because it sounds very exciting. This is a very radically different message that the Alter Rebbe is bringing to the world. Whereas a more common understanding was the real thing is going on in the heavenly, or the real thing is going on by the tzaddikim, or the real thing is going on by those who are far more spiritually sensitized. And what's going on down here in this physical world by the less spiritually sensitive people is a gateway. Yes, you too can become spiritually sensitive. You too can become righteous. But at that moment, it's really just like training wheels. It isn't really changing the person that much. And it's not that, quote, important, but it's a step in the right direction. It's the afilo, the longest journey, even the longest of journeys begins with a single step mentality. Here, the Alter Rebbe turns that completely on in reverse and says that moment of that mitzvah action is, in fact, the whole purpose that gives validity to all the other levels of creation. As Chassidus explains, we talked about this before, what is the tachlis? What is the ultimate purpose that validates all the other steps along the way? You remember just briefly the analogy of the business trip. Why does the guy get up in the morning and get in the car and drive to the airport and wait in line and sit on the plane and take the taxi and go to the meeting and negotiate and so on? It's only so eventually he can buy material items with the money that he makes from that whole process. So whereas the exciting part might be in all the prep and all the presentation, and what happens, we could lose sight of the purpose is to execute the sale. And if he can execute the sale without any of those other steps, then he won't need any of those other steps. So rather than seeing our execution of mitzvah actions as some sort of busy work, where the Alter Rebbe here is saying that all of existence of all of the, quote, higher worlds is linked and is dependent on the mitzvah action of the least naturally aware level of godliness. So again, it's not a competition, but it's saying in essence that doing a, quote, ordinary mitzvah on an ordinary day by an ordinary person is what validates the creation of all the other stages. And this is the Tzimtzum Shaloi Kipshutai concept manifest here tangibly. So again, hopefully I say it every time, this is the whole message of Tanya. This really turns it upside down relative to how this was commonly understood historically. It was not seen this way. It was seen as mitzvah actions, especially by, sort of ordinary people, were kind of ordinary and not all that meaningful, except it kept you off the streets. It kept you out of trouble. But the real thing was going on with the real people. And I've seen this manifest itself in people who start to come along, they're doing mitzvahs, and they're like, okay, when are you going to take me in the basement and show me the real stuff? And the point is, this is the real stuff. This is really what it is. This is truly what it means that we are fulfilling the purpose for which Hashem created the world. And therefore, all of those processes that Hashem engages in to create Atzilus and Bria and the most aware levels, which we are often and even appropriately in awe of, thinking, well, that's really where it's going on. And I'm just, child's play. The Alter Rebbe turns that on its head and says that they only are validated in their existence because we are doing mitzvahs in our most ordinary of ordinary circumstances. Our most ordinary of ordinary mitzvah performance is sustaining all of those processes that have led up to it. The Nimsa turns out Shemaisa HaMitzvahs, that this mitzvah action, Bikiyumam, and its fulfillment, Hu Levush HaPnimi Lipnimius Ratzon HaElyon. It is the innermost purpose for the entirety of why Hashem wants what he wants. Shemimaisa Zeh Nimshach Or V'Chayis Ratzon HaElyon L'Slabesh Boilamais. That from this deed, this person eating the matzah, shaking the lulav, lighting the Shabbos candle, whatever the mitzvah action is, from this deed, it draws out the light, that is the existence, excuse me, the chayis, the life force, the ratzon, the passion of Hashem, to be invested in the world. Because the whole purpose of all of creation is the mitzvahs. So everything only exists to enable these mitzvahs. So when Hashem says to the Jewish people, if you don't accept the Torah, I'm dropping the mountain on your head, which sounds like a threat, it's saying, if you don't accept Torah mitzvahs, there's no point. Just like the guy in the business trip, if he finds out that the deal's been done, there's no point in getting on the plane and so on. But I already paid for the plane ticket. Well, the plane ticket only exists to effectuate the deal. I already got the deal. Why should I bother getting on the plane? Excuse me. V'lachein, for this reason, nikroim evarin damalka derech mashal. Therefore, this is the explanation of this term that we quoted in the beginning of the chapter we put on the screen before, that the mitzvah actions, the Ramach mitzvahs, the 248 thou shalts, are the limbs of the king. What is the mashal of limbs? Why is it saying it's analogous to the limbs? So here the Alter Rebbe digs down on that analogy. Kamoish every guf adam, heim levush lenafshoi. Pardon me. Just like a person's limbs are the garments that express the person, ubetelim legamri eleha, and they are totally subservient to the person. I mean, God forbid, if a person is sickly, their limbs don't respond to their wishes. They can't control their limbs. That's a sign of unhealth. In a natural, healthy circumstance, the limbs are immediately responsive to the person. So when we're doing mitzvahs, these are the limbs that are immediately expressive of the person. Meaning, just like we wouldn't blame the person's hand, we would blame the person, or we wouldn't, on the upside, we wouldn't say his hand did the mitzvah. We would say he did the mitzvah. Similarly, when we do a mitzvah, we don't say that's the person doing the mitzvah. We say that is Hashem doing the mitzvah. We become this total transparency to the infinity of Hashem, visible and implemented via the human behavior. So the mitzvah actions are a genuine expression of the infinity of Hashem. In every single way. They're totally surrendered. And again, God forbid, in an unhealthy circumstance, a person's limbs are not under their control. Otherwise, a person's limbs are an absolute expression of who they are. And again, we wouldn't separate the two and say, well, we should punish his left hand because it did something he shouldn't have done. It's the whole person. I mean, we understand that, again, to illustrate it in that point. And here the Alter Rebbe nuances this. Ki miyad she'oile b'ritzeina shel adam lifshat yodai oy ragloi. At the exact moment that a person has the impulse to extend their hand or their foot, Hey nishmas l'rotzain taketh umiyad b'li shum tzivoy v'amira lehem u'b'li shum shia klal ela karega mamish. It immediately expresses itself. So the person's hand is absolutely the expression of that person. So this is what the mashal means, as the Alter Rebbe will play it out here. When he has this rotzain. Kach derech mashal, so too, as an analogy. And remember, we always have this like sort of tension. Whenever we use a human analogy, we say it's exactly this way. I mean, metaphorically. It's always a tension between is it literal or is it figurative? So here we're saying it's literally figurative, which of course, I mean, we're sort of balancing that act. We are permitted. Torah permits us to use human terminology to describe Hashem. We're permitted to do that. That's not considered disrespectful or not showing proper reverence to Hashem, even though we might argue, how can you compare Hashem to a person? Torah does that, and therefore we're allowed to do that. And yet we always have to remember that it's not a literal analogy. It's only a mechanism for us to have some degree of understanding of what's going on. So, kach derech mashal hachayis shel ma'aseh hamitzvos, the life force that is sustaining that mitzvah, meaning the fact that Hashem wants us to eat matzah, and He wants us to eat matzah on Pesach, and He wants us to eat matzah on the night of Pesach. And if I eat matzah today, it's not a mitzvah. If I eat matzah on Pesach, it is a mitzvah. That is a deliberate message from Hashem. We had this class, this rabbi gave on the history of rabbis in Chicago, and he told about this question that was recorded. A person asked his rabbi that the guy, his father is not well, and he's concerned that since during Shiva he's not permitted to work, and his very busy season is coming up, so he wants to know, can he sit Shiva in advance of his father dying? I mean, his father still living. It just illustrates, it's ridiculous, right? So we all see the immediate comedic value. That's a true story. We all see the immediate comedic value. If we extrapolate that, that's really the point of every mitzvah. Why can't I just eat matzah today in the sukkah, read the Megillah, light the Chanukah? Because the mitzvahs are very particular to very specific times. So whereas other understandings would say, well, that's kind of silly to suggest that God is going to be limited by human time. God is going to be constricted by the calendar. Our counter argument is, on the contrary, that illustrates the true infinity of Hashem, that he embeds himself within the calendar system. So again, the question seems on the surface ridiculous, but then, well, why not? If God is infinite, I could just do it now. Of course, again, that's an actual story, and it just illustrates the general concept that mitzvahs are very particular, and that mitzvah comes from Hashem. And why is that? How do we know that that mitzvah really is Hashem? It's not just, like I calling it, busy work or something for us so that we should remember the Exodus. Because if that's the case, why can't I remember it today? Why do I have to only remember it then? Because that's the will of Hashem. And the fact that it manifests itself in human time, according to a calendar, again, designed by human beings, is not a flaw in God. The more that Hashem is expressed in what we would describe as the limited is not a flaw, it's a feature. It's not a disrespectful ascription of human limitation to Hashem. It is the ultimate manifestation of the whole purpose of creation, that it's really important to Hashem. So why do we do a mitzvah? Because it's really important to Hashem. Yes, it's true that it's beneficial for us and it brings us joy and meaning and purpose and whatever it brings us. All good. But those things you could seemingly get from other circumstances. Yes, you can. No, you can't. We could quibble about it. But this idea that we're doing it for Hashem, as Rabbi Shais Taub says, you serve God your way, I'll serve God his way. If we want to serve God, we got to follow God's instruction, not my instruction. And this is the point that we're making, that the mitzvah actions is totally batal, it is totally aligned with the will of Hashem, the ratzon of Hashem, hamalubish by b'nasalei mamish keguf l'neshama. And so the mitzvah action, the fact that we are required to eat matzah on the first night of Pesach, the fact that we are required to shake the lulav on the first day of Sukkot, is an absolute alignment with Hashem. It doesn't always feel that way. Sometimes we do it and we don't sense what's going on beneath the surface. Okay, that's why the Alter Rebbe wrote Tanya, to let you know that even though you're not having this incredibly epiphanic experience on the night of Pesach, is to let you know that it is fulfilling Hashem's purpose. This is meaningful to Hashem. This is a gift you are giving to Hashem, and you are becoming in perfect alignment with the infinity of Hashem. V'chein halavush hachitzayin shal nefesh elokish shebe'adam hamakayim v'oiseh hamitzvah. This is true not only at. You have a question?
Yeah, I do have a question. And what about when and this applies to very many different kinds of mitzvahs, okay? You learn when you grew up that this is the way you eat the matzah. You do this, or you break this, or you have this much, or whatever. Then you're somewhere else and they say, oh no, it's supposed to be this or this. There's so many variations, and you're like, you want to do what Hashem wants, but which one of these do you know what I mean? Does he get mad if you didn't do the right amount or this or what? I mean,
this is a very, very important point. So the simple answer begins with God is infinite, and as God is going through this difficult, again, using a human term, process of investing himself in this physical world, our anticipation that it's going to line up in perfect slots is not always going to be met. So we're here on this side. And again, just think about our human interactions with people. You want to get somebody something for their birthday. So you try to nuance it perfectly, but we're not always so good at it. We don't always maybe pick up on all the signals. And therefore, we are making everybody, again, all of these halachic opinions, as you're describing, are all pursuing the same goal. What is the way in which Hashem wants this mitzvah done? So we're looking into what Hashem has told us. We're reviewing the data that Hashem has presented to us. And you might even make the argument one step further that if Hashem had to lay it out for us so simplistically, it might not show such a devotion on our side. Like if I have to tell
Mm.
you exactly what to do, down to the literal millimeter, well, then you're not really invested in it. How much
Mhm.
are you willing to pursue it? Who do you, with whom do you share that which is most important to you? With people who you really trust, have a desire to be in alignment with you. And otherwise, I sort of couch it halfway, afraid that I'll tell them exactly and they won't do it. Well, then I'll have no choice but to recognize that I guess I'm just not that important to them. So again, we're trying to squeeze an infinite Hashem into very finite instructions. And therefore, it's not always going to manifest itself in perfect alignment. The significant objective has to be, what is it that Hashem wants in this circumstance? Not what works best for me or what makes most sense to me or what am I most comfortable with. My mission has to be, my objective has to be, what is going to be most meaningful to Hashem in this action. And that's why it sometimes gets complicated. And you could argue maybe Hashem wants it slightly different from Ashkenaz and Sfard, from me and this guy, and so on. But the important premise is, my objective is, what is going to be meaningful to Hashem, not what do I like. So right, it's complicated. That's Gullus.
Yes.
Mashiach, Olam Haba, is clarity. In the Garden of Eden, it was obvious. This good, this no good. And then you have to have the resilience to only do the good and not do the not good. But outside of the Garden of Eden, it's not just the strength to do the right and not the wrong. You always know what's right and what's wrong. It
Right.
gets far more complicated.
Yep. Thank you.
Okay. Now the Alter Rebbe takes us on a description of how the mitzvahs affect us both in our human side and in our spiritual side. Because a mitzvah is a unique combination of our physical self. You have to eat the matzah. It requires your teeth and your tongue and your digestive system and the whole biological process. And there's also a deep spiritual alignment that is evoked from the neshama. So there's two impacts that are happening with each mitzvah. There's the impact that it has on my humanity and the impact it has on my, I'll use the word spirituality, or my spiritual side. So here we go. V'chein halevush hachitza in shel nefesh eloki ba'adam hamakayim v'oisa mitzvah shukayach u'bechinas ha'maisa shelo. So too, the garment, and hopefully this is familiar to you. Remember the three garments, the mechanisms of how we express ourselves through what we think about, concentrate on, willfully contemplate, what we say, and what we do. So, from one perspective, what we do is the least personal. I mean, somebody made this object, but I don't know who it is. And even if it's a handcrafted and wasn't made by a factory, somebody crafted it. Maybe if I was super sensitive, I could know something about him and he was left handed or whatever it is, but I don't know. And it's not that important to me. But when something is said, well, it carries a voice pattern, it carries a style, it's a little easier. I don't know anything about poetry, but if a person is very sensitive and adept in poetry, they hear a poem, they could recognize, oh, this is the type of poem that such a poet would say. And of course, my thoughts are the most personally aligned with me. So the common perception, again, would be what's least personal is least significant. And this is a classic illustration of Chassidus. This is that up is down and down is up. That which we perceive as being least personally expressive, namely action. It's just, I just ate matzah. I just put on tefillin for a few moments. I just lit the menorah for a few moments. And therefore, we might think that that's the least significant because it's not really about me. And we're like, what's with all this perfunctory? Isn't it the thought that counts? Is yes, the thought that counts. But if the action doesn't reflect the deep thought, it's not really that meaningful. So it's the thought that counts can easily become an excuse for not doing the thing because it's the thought that counts. Well, so when a person does the mitzvah and he therefore is investing his neshama in his quote least personal, what's often referred to as lowest um, uh, uh, garment, speech, or action, which we might think, well, it's not that personal, it's not that quote impressive. Well, the pushback to that is that's exactly the point. It's sort of the general idea that if your mother thinks you're cute, that's nice, but it's not exactly an objective opinion. But if the total stranger is admiring, that really has got meaning. So that, to use an example that we're familiar with, that the Hasidim are devoted to the Rebbe, well, obviously that's their whole identity, that's their whole upbringing, that's their whole cultural sense of identity. But that the total stranger who has no social incentive to be aligned with Kedusha, he has no historical incentive. Maybe on the contrary, everything is a disincentive for that. And that he comes to do a mitzvah, Dafka, the guy who's walking down the street who didn't think about putting on tefillin, if you would have asked him this morning, tell me 10 things that might happen to you today, he wasn't going to say put on tefillin. That was not at all on his list of possibilities. And that he stops for that moment and puts on tefillin. Or like the Rebbe spoke about years ago, and today we might go, oh, of course, but the Rebbe spoke about 50 years ago, the guy who drives to shul on Yom Kippur while smoking a cigarette. And he gets out of the car and he puts out a cigarette and he comes in to say Yizkor. And then he goes to work. And you think, oh, guys, look at all the violations. Forget the health issue, when smoking cigarettes was still popular. And driving, and there's evil, yucky poo. Again, we accept those things? No. You're allowed to drive on Yom Kippur? No. You're allowed to smoke cigarettes on Yom Kippur? Absolutely not. But in that moment, when he is saying Yizkor, I know 5 minutes before and 5 minutes after, but in that moment, there is the absolute unity and the infinity of Hashem. In that one moment. So this is that point. That at that moment, like the hand is an immediate expression of the person, at that moment, that person wearing tefillin is an imminent, obvious expression of the infinity of Hashem. You may recall from 2 years ago, it's gotten maybe a little better, whatever, the Chabad at the University of Pennsylvania, there was protesters and people screaming and all this terrible stuff. And there's a guy, the shliach is there with some college student who, I don't know that college student learned Chitas that morning, and I don't know if he learns 3 chapters of Rambam, but he's putting on tefillin. And the marchers are going past him screaming what they're screaming. And this guy's putting on tefillin. Now, again, you don't have to be deeply spiritually aware to say that's God defying the darkness. There it is. There you see the infinity of Hashem manifest because there's no social incentive. There may be even a little bit of a sense of danger, certainly uncomfortable and so on, not a safe space for this person. And yet he's standing out there while these evil people are marching past him, screaming what they're screaming, and he's putting on tefillin. That's the infinity of Hashem. And the Alter Rebbe is telling us that's what happens every time you do a mitzvah. You become the conduit of the infinity of Hashem. Yalkein, and therefore, Gam Evrei Gofa Adam, Hamakaimim HaMitzvah, Shekayechu Bechinas HaMaisa Shal Never Shal Akis Mulubish Behem Mishas Maisa V'Kiyam HaMitzvah. So too, every time your physical body is doing a mitzvah, at that moment, that you are fulfilling the mitzvah. At that moment, your physical being is fulfilling the mitzvah, and it is in total alignment with the infinity of Hashem. At that moment, just like that guy standing out in obvious defiance to the evil that is passing by him, and you don't have to have learned all of Chassidus to recognize that this is a deeply godly experience. The same is true every time you do a mitzvah. Every physical mitzvah act, you are the conduit for the transparency of the infinity of Hashem. So again, the guy is coming to the Alter Rebbe and he's saying, I'm kind of not feeling it. And the Alter Rebbe is telling him that when you do a mitzvah, even if you don't recognize it, you are bringing this, you are changing the infinity of Hashem into this physical world through your physical body, not just in some deeply spiritual sense, that too, but not only also, but in a sense, more importantly, in this physical world. Kagoyin, for example, Hayad hamechalekes tzedakah la'aniyim oisem mitzvah cheres. For example, when your hand gives tzedakah, so you think, what am I doing? I'm taking a few dollars, I'm putting it in the pushka. It doesn't seem to be a tremendously spiritual experience. It doesn't seem to be an incredibly transformative moment. And yet what we're saying is at that moment, Hashem is operating completely through you. You are a total high fidelity transmitter of the infinity of Hashem. And here the Alter Rebbe adds, not only when you're actually doing the mitzvah, not only in the actual mitzvah moment, but even when you are engaging in walking to do the mitzvahs, even though at that moment you're not doing the mitzvah, at that moment you're just walking to do the mitzvah. So you might think, well, when I get there and I do the mitzvah, then I'm transmitting the infinity of Hashem. But right now, I'm just on my way to do the mitzvah. Well, the Alter Rebbe is telling you that since it necessitates your physical transportation of self to get there to do the mitzvah, that moment is also the infinity of Hashem. That is also the infinity of Hashem. V'chein hapas, so too your mouth, v'loshen, and the tongue. Shemedabrim divrei Torah, that speaks words of Torah. V'amoyach shemahar b'divrei Torah, v'yirah shemayim, glus Hashem baruch hu. And your mind, when it thinks about godliness. So the petitioner here has come to the Alter Rebbe. Basically, I'm not feeling it. This isn't. It's not spiritually aligning with me, and so on. So the Alter Rebbe is telling him, even if you're not aware of it, that this is the infinity that you are experiencing. So, in contrast to the previous chapter, where the Alter Rebbe talked about that the Sitra Achra, the opposition of godliness, is emboldened by its concealment of godliness. So it thinks that I'm also an authority here, even if it doesn't deny Hashem entirely. The fact that it purports its own identity and says, well, this is what I think, that's what God thinks, this is what I think, and how that is a total detachment from God. It's a form of idolatry because I am ascribing authority to anything other than Hashem, that we talked about so much in the last chapter, that I've stepped out of the relationship. Well, here the Alter Rebbe is saying that when I do a mitzvah, even if I don't realize it, I am in total perfect alignment with the infinity of Hashem, even though it doesn't seem that way, even though I don't sense that at any level. The Hester Panim, the concealment of God's face that we talked about in the previous chapter, is offset here, or is in contrast here, with the Giloi Panim, the revelation of godliness, as a consequence of total bittul. And that's the part that's up to me. So the Alter Rebbe is laying out the facts for you. Here are the facts. The facts are that when you do a mitzvah, or even when you are physically engaged in getting ready for the mitzvah, and it may not feel all that deeply, and I'll use this word semi-sarcastically, spiritual. It may not feel so spiritual. And I use that word a little bit tongue-in-cheek. It may not feel that way. The Alter Rebbe is telling you, bottom line, that you are in perfect alignment with Hashem, just like the hand is in perfect alignment with the person. Just like when I do this, it's because I want to do it. The hand has no independent significance or stature or authority, better. Similarly, when I do a mitzvah, I am conducting the infinity of godliness into this world in a manner more profound than the angels, etc., etc. And this is that, it's a lot of duty placed upon us because of our opportunity. So you gotta, which didn't always sit so well with people. We've talked about this before, where the Baal Shem Tov said that the simple Jew can serve Hashem just like the righteous scholar, and some righteous scholars were not so down with it. Well, some simple Jews were not so down with it because, like, you expect me to do this? This is for rabbi. This is for holy people. This is for. I'm a fan. My rabbi is holy. I go. He's the greatest Rebbe. I have the greatest Rebbe. What about you? Me? I'm a fan. We won the Super Bowl, kind of thing. Well, what are you doing? This is very much our Rebbe's message. Everybody, all hands on deck, like the old fire brigade. You can't say, well, I'm not so good at it. All hands on deck. Everybody's got to participate. You can't just skip this one and say, well, you do it. It's for holy people, rabbis, and so on and so forth. It's a lot of obligation, and not everybody was so down with it. It's demanding. It's not always so. Again, I use that word, comfortable. And here the Alter Rebbe is telling him that he is in total alignment with the infinity of Hashem and validating every step of creation that brought him to this moment. And this is very much why we are a seize the opportunity mentality, that Hashem has rearranged all of creation, Hashgacha Pratis, for you to have this moment to do this particular physical mitzvah. And look, if you don't do it, Hashem will rearrange all of creation again. But in this moment, we are given the opportunity, and I'll use this word, to validate Hashem's trust in us. The fact that Hashem trusts us, we are going to validate that by cherishing it and working with it. That is our opportunity. And this is what our sages teach, that our forefathers, Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, they're described as the Merkava. Now, the word Merkava means a chariot. We've seen this analogy before, or metaphor, I guess, that just as a chariot has no will of its own, it is completely subservient to its rider. We don't say the car drives great. We say the driver drives it well. Like the artist has the same paintbrush that the child has. The poet has the same words. He doesn't have different words, better words. It's the same pencil. It's the same car, and so on. So our avos were totally and absolutely surrendered to the infinity of Hashem. Everything they did was only at the will of Hashem. And it became evident. We talk about Kiddush Hashem. Now, sometimes this is abused by those who don't like us, but that's our goal. Not that they should think I personally have done something fantastic. They should say the God of the Jews is wonderful because look at what he does. Look at what the people who are in alignment with him and how they conduct themselves. And that's the idea. It's like a transparency. People shouldn't see me. They should see the infinity of Hashem. What is this characteristic of being a Merkava? That their entire physical existence, the entirety of everything about themselves, was total subservience to and directed towards the fulfillment of Hashem's purpose and interest. Meaning, it's not like, well, I want to eat because I'm hungry. But Hashem said to only eat kosher, so I'll only eat kosher food because that's what Hashem said. Meaning, the only reason why I want to eat is to fulfill the mitzvah of kashrus. That's why I want to eat. As there's a story in the Talmud that Hillel, before he would eat, he would announce, I'm now going to do a kindness for my stranger. So the common interpretation is that Hillel was so detached from the physical world that he considered his body to be like a stranger, almost a nuisance. And the Rebbe explains a little bit of a tweak of that Hillel is demonstrating to us how excited we should be to fulfill the mitzvah of helping a physical body. So rather than seeing it as, again, I eat. Why do I eat? Because I'm hungry. And Hashem said, only eat kosher. Okay, so I restrain or restrict my eating to kosher. But in that mentality, the objective is still, I eat because I'm hungry and I have to survive. Why do I have to survive? What do you mean? That becomes the end of the conversation. That, of course, you have to survive. Why? What do you mean? I have to survive. What is the purpose? What is the goal? What is the mission of your survival? It became a mission of its own. So our avos, they had no interest, they had no rutzai, no passion, no desire for their own um, physical sensation. It was purely for the service of Hashem, just like the business trip. I don't want to go on the plane and this. I just want to make the deal. If I can make the deal without all that other stuff, I'm going to do it. But what can happen? We get so caught up in what we want to do that we forgot that we're supposed to be doing in the service of Hashem, even if it's kosher, kosher, kosher. Even if it's kosher, 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 if it's still, now it's mine, sort of out of my way, jostling at the buffet line for the food, even though I davened Ma'ariv and I was kind and helpful. But in that moment, if it's about, well, I'm hungry, well, if it's only about I'm hungry, then it's a disconnect from the infinity of Hashem. And they only were a merkava, a total tool in the hands of the infinity of Hashem for the entirety of their life and existence. Well, in a similar fashion, this is the point that the Alter Rebbe makes every time we do a mitzvah. Every time we do a mitzvah, we are experiencing this level of alignment with Hashem in physical as well as spiritual awareness. That is, our physical being becomes this. And again, this is that idea that mitzvahs are made for the sustainability of the world and God's objective. So it's true, as Uncle Moshe says, mitzvahs make you happy, mitzvahs make you glad. It's true. We're not against that. Just like if somebody does a kindness for me and they do it with a smile and it's their joy and happiness, that's a beautiful thing. It makes it better. But if I'm only doing it for my joy and happiness, then I only do as much as I want. And then I work through my sense of obligation, my sense of guilt, or whatever it is. And now, leave me alone. But here we're trying to turn it around. Not only is that the objective, that becomes that brings the awareness, and this is sort of the beauty of it, that when we're doing a physical mitzvah, even though it feels rather ordinary, I'm just putting a few dollars in the pushka, and that moment I am in total alignment with the infinity of Hashem. And just like, again, I gave that example, and hopefully you can think of many other examples, where that guy putting on tefillin as these crazy, evil people are marching past. You see godliness, that is Hashem. Or if you've seen this, God forbid, but in the physical, the way that the body will strive to live and will long to retain its life. And say, but what's the point? You can't play tennis. You don't have any fun. But there is this desire to be alive. You see the godliness there. Now imagine if we could see that all the time, that every time we said a bracha and every time we did a mitzvah, we saw and sensed that infinity of Hashem. Imagine that. That would be this almost like electrical current that runs right through us that becomes evident and obvious. So the Alter Rebbe is assuring the student here, that is what's happening, even if you don't recognize it. And it's happening even in your physical self. It's happening to your physical body, not just in some abstract sense. But your physical hand is in total alignment with the infinity of Hashem in that moment. And then, of course, we're going to talk about what happens when you learn Torah and how that creates an even more profound alignment with the infinity of Hashem. All right, to be continued.